All right, and so welcome back to the series here. In this video, we're going to take a look at adding a little bit more complexity or personality to our speaker material, or the main plastic material that we have going on, to learn just how we can kind of add a little bit more life or excitement to our materials here, and see how we can go about creating multiple variations of skins or materials for these assets procedurally and relatively quickly now that we have the main materials set up here. So I'm going to come down into our main materials, and I'm going to go to our speaker, and I'm going to open this in context mode there. So we're going to have all of this coming back up. And I want to come into our base color here because we're going to be adding just some new colors and a new kind of design to our speaker. And so I'm going to pull this guy out over here if I can grab it. Come on, work with me there. And the first design I want to do is I kind of want to have some flames coming from the end of the speaker here and kind of pushing themselves back towards the body here. And so to create the initial design, I'm going to go ahead and just add a gradient linear one. And you can see with this gradient, right, it's going to give us a black value and slowly blend towards a white value. And I'll just blend this together real quick. And we have to make sure that this is in color mode, so I'm going to add a gradient map node. All right, and so we're going to get our gradient showing up here, but the problem is, right, you can see that it's actually going up and down here. But the UVs for this guy, if we take a look, are right here. So they're actually left and right. So this area over here is this area here, and this one right here is the end of the speaker there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to come over to this guy here, rotate him 90 degrees there. So we're going to get our guy showing up this way here. So now we can play around with our gradient. So I'm going to click on this guy here, and we can start adding some nice fiery colors to it, right? So the white area is going to be over on the side here. If I crank this guy up, there we go, it's going to show up. So I want this to be my kind of darker orange, kind of like reddish almost. And maybe a little bit too. Let's bring it a little bit more orangey. There we go. I'm going to add another point just by clicking on there and bring this guy in towards the red. And I'm actually going to flip these guys here, just our order. So we have our deeper red more on the inside there. There we go. And this black value, I'm going to make this guy more of a yellow here. So this is how we're going to pretty much start with just adding the colors to our albedo. And we'll go ahead and now start to mask it off so we can kind of get a better representation of what's going to happen, right? Because we don't want this to show up inside here. You can see one of our very harsh seam lines there. And you can see it's showing up pretty much on the rest of our material here. So I'm going to go ahead and come down here, and this is the area I'm going to create my mask. So I'm going to use a shape node here, and I'll plug this guy in. And I'm going to want to come over and actually not add any of those. I'm going to add a resource, and I'm going to use my UVs, right? Because I'm going to try and figure out how we can isolate this UV island there. So if I bring this down a little bit, I'm going to set my bitmap to grayscale, and I'm going to blend these guys together. So I'm going to drag that out and add a blend. And I'm going to do the multiply Oh, actually, no, sorry. I mean, I'm going to do the screen. There we go. So we're going to be able to see this up top there. So I'm going to add a transformation node. And I want to make sure again that this does not tile. Go to absolute and no tiling. And so now I want to be able to bring this shape down, and I want to be able to just overlay it on top of this rectangular guy here. So what I'm going to do is just display those both, maybe give myself a little bit more room here, and just bring it down. And we're just going to play a game of lining them up. So again, maybe have a little bit of padding just for extra insurance there. Bring this guy over. There. And we can bring this guy up. And I'm just going to drag it off. Whoop, just so that we're 100% positive that it goes off the UVs there. And that's looking pretty good. So you can see now that for our mask, we've just masked off the entirety of our speaker here. So I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of this guy. And instead of having it just a solid color, I want to now go ahead and start actually affecting this mask here to give it a little bit more of like a fire pattern or a little bit of like flames or embers, right? So I'm going to create a Gaussian noise. And I'm just going to plug this guy in here. And we're going to plug this guy into our mask. And you can see now we're pretty much going to just screw up everything we've done. But I'm going to go ahead and I want to change the blending mode of this. So I'm going to use a multiply so that any of the noise that we create in this little chain here is only going to be able to affect the area that we've masked off for our speaker over here. So now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and create another shape node because I want to create a more solid version and actually just use this noise to distort the shape that we make here. And I'm going to use a warp node. Now, in order to be able to see the warping effect, we actually have to have a little bit of black value in our texture set here, because otherwise there's no values to warp. So it's just going to be warping white value on top of white value there. So if I come to our shape and I just decrease it on the X here, you can see now we're going to start to get some warping and some different kind of geometry or shape there. So now if I plug this guy in instead, you can see that we're going to start to get some kind of whips and whisks and all that kind of stuff, right? And we've just masked this off to this particular area. So I can play around with the size of these flames, right? Just by playing around with the scale of this noise here. I also can play around with how much of our speaker it takes up just by playing around with the X size here, right? So if I bring this down, you can see that we're just kind of getting a little bit of the rim there. And if I crank this all the way up, we're pretty much going to cover the entire length of this speaker here. I'm going to do something like 0.4. And actually 0.4 is a little bit too low there. Let's try something like 0.6. And that's looking pretty cool. I might do actually 0.65 just to get a little bit more in there. You can play around with the disorder of our flames. That's looking pretty neat. And we can also play around with the gradient map, right? We can play around with the colors that we introduce, right? If we want it to be, you know, kind of cool and, you know, new age or new wave or whatever, we can add a little bit of neon colors. We can play around with the position of these colors as well, right? And this is going to allow us to be entirely procedural with it. So we're not going to really destroy any of our materials by playing around with these values. And so I maybe want to introduce some more yellow into this guy here. And maybe we still have a little bit too much red, so I'll bring this back a little bit. Maybe now too much yellow. And again, this is just another kind of finessing style game here where you're going to play around with these colors to really get what look you're desiring. So that's looking pretty cool. I'm pretty happy with that guy there. And so this is going to be the first pattern that we're going to create. So the next material I'm going to make is kind of like a watermelon looking thing. I don't know, it gives me kind of melon vibes. I'm not really sure a better way to explain it, but it's a kind of neat looking texture there. And it's only going to take us a couple notes to make. So I'm going to come over here, just give ourselves a little bit more room. And I'll just add another blend onto this guy here. And I'm going to go ahead and add a gradient linear 2. And again, we've seen this a couple times here. And I'm just going to tile this up to something like 15. So I'm going to plug this guy in. We need to use a gradient node here. And now you can see pretty much the effect we're going to get. And if I come over to our seam, we're not really going to notice it too much just because of the darker area here. And so now we can go ahead and start giving these a little bit of color. So I'm going to have that area be a little bit more of like a kind of like a lime green. Maybe that's a little too bright. Maybe give that something a little bit darker. And actually, I want to give this top guy here a little bit more towards the yellow, the yellowish green there. Just add a little bit more subtle color there. And I'm going to take this black value and again, just make it a darker green. There we go, just so it's not so so harsh there. All right, and again, we're going to have to mask off this area, but we've already created that mask over here, right, with this guy over here. So I'm going to just use that as the opacity right now. So that's pretty cool. Now we've got this guy set up. And I maybe don't like, how just the gradient, how it's kind of rounded like that. And so I can come in and I'm going to add a curve node. And like we've used the curve node in the past, we can just go ahead and start playing around with the shapes a little bit, right? Can make it a little bit sharper of a fall off. Can play around with adding some more visual intrigue there. Maybe make that a little bit more distinct that way. Maybe bring this back. I don't like how sharp this is. Just a nice kind of soft roll off. And like I've said before, the possibilities with this are pretty endless in terms of what you want to do here. We could do something kind of funky like that. And so the last texture I'm going to make is kind of a variation of this, but we're going to add a little bit more directionality with it and actually have a spiral around our UVs here. And we're going to take a look at how we can do that. So I'm going to add another blend. I'm going to take our gradient linear here and drag this guy out and use a curve. Oh, I keep doing that again. I keep hitting space. Don't hit space after you drag it out. Add a curve node. I'm going to add a gradient map to this guy. And then I'm going to do a transform 2D node. All right, and so let's just blend this guy in right now and see what it's looking like. And again, it's going to look pretty similar. I'm going to just take our mask so we know what we're dealing with. And so I want to make sure that our colors are very rigid and not very gradiated. So if I come into our gradient map here, I'm going to click this guy. Let's make him, we'll just make him red for now. I'm going to make another red. And I'll make this guy, let's just make him a blue here. And you can see that as we bring these two up to meet, they're going to be very harsh in their positions, pretty much beside each other there. So I'm going to add the same blue here, bring this over, and I'm going to make this guy white. And again, just add this white value here to stack up against this guy. So now you can see that we're going to get some very solid and defined lines. And actually, we probably aren't even going to need this curve node here for that. If I come back into our gradient editor, I now want to really bump up the amount of space that the white guy has there, really decrease the amount that the red one has. And same thing for this blue guy here. Again, we're going to bring that in just so that we get some kind of pinstripe looking texture to it. And that's looking pretty neat. I like that. And actually, I might want to come in just to, oops, wrong node there. Play around with this blue value again. Maybe just make it a little bit lighter there, more like a navy blue. There we go, just a very subtle difference there. And so now we can go ahead and play around with the transform or the rotation of this to line it up so that we actually have it spiraling around our UVs there. So in this transform node, I'm just going to hold down Shift and I'm going to click over here and I'm just going to rotate it. And you can see as our rotation has occurred, we're going to get this spiraling around, kind of like twisting around our mesh here. And that's looking pretty cool. But we're going to have to be very cognizant of the fact that it's not going to line up very easily on our UV seam here. So if I just come over here, and I'm just going to slowly start to rotate this guy to see on our mesh here where stuff is going to line up. And actually that was pretty close. Maybe just a little bit more this way. Oh, got me. I almost had it. All right, let's see here. All right, and that's pretty close. And if we take a look back here, you're not going to really be able to notice the seam there. And so now, obviously, we can play around with our gradient linear. We can add more or less. So now that we've completed the three kind of new and interesting variations on our material here, how can we go ahead and just kind of seamlessly switch or swap between these three here, rather than having to come into this material graph every time and, you know, click and drag and start bringing in and swapping the different blends that we have here. And so to make this a little bit more efficient, we actually have a specific node that's going to allow us to swap between these different inputs relatively easy. And the node is going to be our multi-switch. And again, we have a multi-switch grayscale and a multi-switch for color inputs. And so I'm going to choose this multi-switch because we're working again with color here. And if we come down to this node, you can see that we have input 1 and input 2. And so we can change the number of these inputs relatively seamlessly here, right? You can see that the number of inputs is pretty much just easily swapping with whatever value that I've got on my slider here. And so I want to do 4 different inputs, right? because we want to do this barbershop looking one. We want to do this kind of melon looking one. We want to do our fire, but we also want to just do our regular normal plastic material, just in case we don't want to have these kind of wacky textures on it either. And so I'm going to plug this one in, just our regular normal texture, into our input 1 here. And this is going to be the first input if we select this guy again. On our input selection, you could see that it starts on 1, and that's going to be basically indicative of whatever we put in that particular input. So the second input I want to do is I'm going to use this blend here, right, for our fire, and plug that guy in over here. And that's going to be our input 2. I'm going to take our blend for this guy here and plug that guy into input 3. And then again, our little barbershop one, I'm going to plug into our output 4 there. And so now I want to go ahead and rearrange this a little bit to make a little bit of more visual sense as to what's happening here. So I'm going to bring these guys over here up, because this is going to be, again, our first input. Our fire is going to be our second input. This is going to be our third input. And then if I bring these guys down, this is going to be our fourth input. So if I plug that guy in, you can see that it's a little bit of a kind of like a smorgasbord here, but hopefully you can kind of see that we're drawing all of this initial color data from our original version of this, and then just plugging it into different blend nodes. If we just compute our thumbnails here, and using that for various different variations of the texture. And again, I maybe want to plug this guy into these nodes in specific rather than using the fire one here, right? Because just in case we didn't have something that covered the entirety of this, it might actually start showing some fire underneath some of these textures. And so you can see that now our final output is going to be just our base material here, because, right, we've plugged our first input as our base material. But if I come and play around with the input selection, right, we're going to go to 2, and now it's going to be our fire. And the same thing for 3, it will be our melon one. And number 4 is going to be our barbershop one. So we can go ahead now and expose these parameters. So I'm going to leave the input number because I don't want to change that accidentally in our parent graph, but I'm going to go ahead and change the input selection. So we're going to use our input selection parameter. And if I come down to the parameters here, we can also see now our input selection. And I'm going to call this pattern selection instead. And again, I'm going to play around with our defaults. So I'm going to clamp it. And we're going to have our max as 4 and our min as 1, right? So we can only choose a value of 1, 2, 3, or 4. And we want to make sure that our step is on 1, right? Because if we go and decrease that, it's still going to work, but it's going to give us a little bit of weird results. I think if we bring it down to, you know, like the default of 0.01, if we change our default back to 1 here, and we scroll it up as being like 1.01, 1.02, we'll have to get to 1.51 for it to then change to the second input, right? So it kind of works on that majority factor where as soon as you reach the threshold as being closer to a whole value, either rounded up or rounded down, it will then switch to that input. It doesn't really make a lot of sense because you only really want to have the ability to choose 4 inputs. So just leave the step value on 1 and it will just kind of work as intended. So now if I come into our megaphone graph here, and I come over to our speaker, you can see that we've got our speaker color, text color, intensity, and all that. And now we have this pattern selection. So if I drag this guy over, we're going to have the ability to play around with these in our parent graph here. And so we can go ahead and use these to basically just change the look and the style of this megaphone relatively quickly without having to go in and again play around with all of these parameters. And so in this video, we took a look at creating a few more variations for our albedo for our material to just give it a little bit more personality. And I would definitely encourage you to spend maybe a little more time playing around with and fine-tuning these. But you can see how quickly we can iterate and create new skins and alternatives and variations of these materials for our asset, and how quickly we can swap between them and mix and match to create interesting and new and unique materials for our assets here. In the next video, we're going to take a look at how we can go ahead and export all of these textures that comprise of our material so that we can finally start using these for our asset in game.